Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the return of Liesl Albrecht to Port Charles was not merely an emotional homecoming, it was the ignition of a long-dormant firestorm, one that would sweep through the lives of those who thought they could manipulate, exploit, and betray without consequence. For months, Nina Reeves had been walking through life like a ghost. Haunted by secrets she couldn't share, isolated from the people she loved, and silenced by the invisible noose that Drew Kane had tightened around her throat. Her marriage to Sonny Corinthos was unraveling under the weight of half-truths and journalistic attacks. Her daughter Willow Tate, once a beacon of moral clarity, had been slowly transformed into someone else entirely, someone pliable, submissive, and unknowingly entrapped. And through it all, Nina suffered in silence, carrying the guilt of her own past while watching helplessly as Drew, the man she once believed to be a hero, turned into something far more insidious. So when Liesl appeared unannounced at Crimson, it was more than a reunion between aunt and niece, it was a reckoning. The moment Liesl entered Nina's office, time seemed to pause. Nina, barely able to hold herself together, embraced her aunt with trembling arms. The reunion, filled with warmth and smiles, was quickly overshadowed by Liesl's sharp instincts. She had always been able to sense when something was wrong, and what she saw in Nina's eyes, fear, exhaustion, and desperation, confirmed her worst suspicions. Liesl didn't press immediately. She waited. She offered tea, conversation, and gentle space. And when Nina finally broke down, it came like a flood. Every detail, every manipulated moment, every whisper from Drew that chipped away at Willow's sense of self, spilled out with harrowing clarity. Nina explained how Drew had gradually assumed control over Willow's daily life, managing her appointments, screening her texts, even deciding who she could or couldn't confide in. He used soft language, concerned tones, and twisted logic to make his control seem like protection. He told Willow that Nina was a threat, that too much contact with her mother would only stir up old pain. And Nina, desperate to preserve some connection, had acquiesced, until the truth became too unbearable. She confessed how Drew had used knowledge of Nina's connection to Portia Robinson's past ketamine dealings as leverage, threatening to destroy her public image and cut her off from Willow forever if she resisted his will. The threat wasn't empty. Already, whispers had begun to surface in the press. Drew was cunning. He understood how to use silence, fear, and emotional manipulation as weapons, and he had become terrifyingly good at it. Liesl listened without interruption, but inside, something primal stirred. This was not the Drew she remembered, the man who had suffered under Peter August's captivity, the man who had fought for redemption and second chances. This Drew had shifted into something calculating and cold. Whether it was trauma, external influence, or something more sinister, a clone, perhaps, or a pawn in a larger scheme, Liesl didn't know. But what she did know was that she would not allow another man to ruin her family. Not again. She had lost her son Nathan because of the machinations of cruel men. She had once captured and tortured Peter in a forest cabin, nearly burning him alive for his crimes. And now, with Drew targeting Nina and manipulating Willow, the mother wolf in Liesl was wide awake. Her first step was to reconnect with Rocco Falconeri. Their meeting at the cafe was both heartwarming and strategically essential. Rocco, now a young man growing into his own, was full of questions, about Brit, about the past, about the state of things in Port Charles. Liesl answered honestly, acknowledging Brit's flaws but also celebrating her strength and refusal to conform. Brit had lived on her own terms, even in her final moments. Liesl reminded Rocco that truth mattered more than perfection. As they spoke, Liesl probed gently, gathering names, timelines, and subtle shifts in behavior around town. Rocco mentioned changes in Drew's demeanor, how he had distanced himself from the community, become more secretive, and increasingly possessive of Willow. These observations were all Liesl needed to solidify her suspicions. Then came a new layer of intrigue. Jason Morgan had returned to Port Charles, escorting Sasha Gilmore and her baby Daisy to a new safe home. But something had caught his attention, A woman who looked exactly like Britt had appeared briefly at the airport. Jason's reaction was visceral. The idea that Britt might be alive, or that someone was impersonating her, rattled him deeply. When Liesl learned of this, her mind began connecting pieces. What if Drew's sudden change, the reappearance of someone who looked like Britt, and the silence surrounding old enemies like Victor Cassadine weren't isolated incidents? What if this was all part of a wider plot that was only now surfacing? Determined, Liesl began coordinating with Jason. While he investigated the mysterious woman at the airport and followed leads about possible WSB involvement, Liesl turned her full attention to Drew. She and Nina began building a case. Discreetly obtaining digital records, accessing surveillance footage from Crimson, and hiring a forensic psychologist to review Willow's behavior. Liesl even reached out to old contacts in Europe to track Drew's past movements. What they uncovered was damning: irregular financial transactions, encrypted communications with unidentified sources, and records indicating psychological influence techniques dating back to his captivity. Meanwhile, Willow began noticing the subtle cracks in Drew's mask. He began forbidding her from attending appointments alone. He dictated who she could follow on social media. He controlled narratives about their relationship, often gaslighting her when she questioned his actions. Liesl, careful and deliberate, never directly accused Drew but instead shared personal stories with Willow, stories of how control can feel like love, how abuse hides behind concern. Willow began to listen. She saw the truth in Liesl's eyes, in the pain etched on Nina's face. Piece by piece, her world began to unravel. The wedding day arrived with the veneer of perfection. Held at the illustrious Metro Court ballroom, it promised elegance and celebration. The guests arrived dressed in their finest. Sonny was absent, still processing his own fractured relationship with Nina. Jason loitered outside, prepared for anything. And Liesl, dressed not just for the occasion but for battle, stood beside Nina, holding the folder that would break everything apart. As Willow stood before the altar, her hand trembling in Drew's, Liesl stepped forward. The music stopped. Conversations died. All eyes turned to the formidable figure of Liesl Albrecht as she handed Willow the folder. The silence was suffocating. Willow opened the file with hesitant fingers, and as her eyes scanned the contents. Text messages, financial records, psychological assessments, her face went pale. She looked at Drew. He tried to speak, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. She removed her ring, placed it firmly in his palm, and stepped away. A single tear fell, not out of sorrow, but of liberation. Drew's downfall was swift. Within hours, authorities arrested him on multiple charges: coercion, blackmail, unauthorized surveillance, financial fraud, and psychological abuse. The Drew who had once been lauded as a hero was exposed as a manipulator who preyed on emotional vulnerability. Port Charles was left stunned. Reputations were shattered. Trust was broken. But for Nina, there was peace. Her daughter was free. Her conscience was clean. And most importantly, she was no longer alone. Liesl stood by her, not as a shadow from the past, but as a fierce protector of the future. Together, they rebuilt, relationship by relationship, truth by truth. Willow began healing. Wiley and Amelia were shielded from further trauma. Jason, moved by the revelations, stayed close, watching and waiting for the next ripple of danger. Liesl, once seen as a villain, had become the avenging angel of Port Charles. Not through violence or chaos, but with intelligence, compassion, and relentless courage. Her return was not just a plot twist. It was a revolution. And for the first time in a long time, the people of Port Charles saw clearly who their enemies were. And who had the strength to stand against them. Liesl Albrecht had come home. And she had brought justice with her. The apex of the entire ordeal arrived with dramatic precision on what was meant to be a day of joy, the highly anticipated wedding of Drew Kane and Willow Tate. The event had been meticulously planned, a showcase of love and success staged in none other than the Grand Metro Court Hotel, the social epicenter of Port Charles. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, its polished floors reflecting the opulence of soft candlelight and tasteful floral arrangements in ivory and blush tones. Rows of guests, an eclectic blend of powerful citizens, respected professionals, and longtime friends, filled the space with polite conversation and hopeful smiles. There was music, there was champagne, and there was the illusion of happiness. But beneath the elegant surface, tension rippled. Unseen to most but felt palpably by those who knew the full scope of the hidden truth. Willow, radiant in her wedding gown yet visibly anxious, stood just moments from walking down the aisle. Drew waited for her at the altar, composed in appearance but with a grip that tightened around the ring box in his palm. The officiant had opened his folder. Guests turned in their seats, anticipating the bride's entrance. It was the perfect moment, until it wasn't. Without warning, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened with a definitive thud, slicing through the ceremony's delicate silence like a scalpel. All heads turned. Standing in the threshold were three figures: Liesl Albrecht, dressed not for celebration but for confrontation in a deep crimson coat, Nina Reeves, visibly trembling but resolved, and a sharply dressed woman holding a leather-bound briefcase, an attorney whose presence immediately signaled that this was no ordinary interruption. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Eyes darted between the bridal party and the unexpected arrivals. Liesl walked forward with the unwavering posture of a woman who had endured loss, tragedy, and injustice, and emerged as a reckoning. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she approached the altar. Nina followed beside her, clenching a manila folder with both hands as though it weighed as much as her entire heart. The officiant stopped. The music halted mid-measure. And the entire room froze in suspended disbelief. Willow stood still, her veil partially obscuring her features, though the confusion and fear in her eyes were unmistakable. Liesl gave her a brief nod, of love, of truth, of maternal protection, and then stepped aside. Nina, voice barely above a whisper but shaking with emotion, extended the folder to Willow. Inside was not a letter of apology or a blessing for her marriage. It was evidence. Pages of it. Documentation of months of manipulation, detailed financial records, surveillance screen captures, transcripts of phone calls, medical appointment data, all meticulously compiled by Liesl and Jason in their months-long investigation. There were recordings of Drew issuing veiled threats, traced bank transfers proving coercion, and even notes from a psychological expert outlining the patterns of emotional abuse and cognitive manipulation. Willow's hands trembled as she flipped through the contents. Her breath caught. Each page chipped away at her understanding of the man standing before her. Drew remained still, eyes wide, the facade beginning to crack. He opened his mouth, perhaps to plead, to explain, to lie one last time, but no words came. Willow lifted her gaze and met his eyes. For a moment, the room vanished. There was no crowd, no priest, no flowers, only two people, and a chasm of betrayal between them. Her veil slipped from her shoulder. Her fingers unclasped the engagement ring from her left hand. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She extended her arm and dropped the ring into Drew's hand with an audible clink, the final punctuation to a story rewritten in front of everyone. As he reached instinctively to hold her hand, to anchor her in place, Willow stepped back. One step. Then another. And finally, she turned and walked away. The hem of her gown whispered against the floor as she moved through the stunned congregation, who parted like water in her wake. No one dared to speak. Even the air in the room seemed to still. The silence that followed was deafening. Drew remained frozen at the altar, holding the ring and the wreckage of his narrative. Humiliation washed over him like a wave. He had been exposed. Not by whispers, not in shadows, but in full view of the entire town. His reputation shattered, his plans collapsed, and his bride, the woman he thought he had bent so carefully to his will, was gone. Before the murmurs of the crowd could escalate, federal agents entered the ballroom through the side entrance. The attorney accompanying Liesl presented the warrants. Drew's shock turned to fury as handcuffs were placed around his wrists. A few guests gasped. Others looked away. Jason stood in the background, arms folded, silent but unwavering. He had done what needed to be done. The truth had been served cold and clean. Drew was escorted out of the Metro court under federal custody, the whispers now replaced by a low rumble of disbelief and speculation. Accusations included but were not limited to emotional coercion, psychological abuse, financial manipulation, obstruction of medical autonomy, and illicit surveillance. Liesl stood in quiet defiance as Drew passed her, her gaze unforgiving and absolute. Nina, tears staining her cheeks, turned toward Willow, who had stopped at the end of the aisle. In that moment, mother and daughter simply held each other's eyes. No more secrets. No more distance. Only love, fragile and scarred, but finally real. In the aftermath, the once hopeful event would be remembered as the day Port Charles witnessed justice unfold in real time. The newspapers would spin headlines. The gossip would be relentless. But for those who had known the truth, who had lived in fear and silence, it was a day of liberation. Willow retreated from public view, choosing solitude and reflection over press statements or explanations. Nina remained by her side, no longer just a controversial public figure but a mother who had risked everything to save her child. Jason resumed his quiet post in the background, vigilant as ever. And Liesl, victorious in the most precise and emotionally charged way, reminded all of Port Charles of one unshakable truth: when darkness festers in the hearts of those who pretend to protect, it is often the unlikely angels, those forged in pain, who rise to banish it. The wedding that was supposed to mark the union of love instead became a courtroom of reckoning, a final testament that lies may build a ceremony, but truth will always crash the altar. And in Port Charles, no secret stays buried for long. Not when Lisel Albrecht is watching. Willow's liberation marked not only the collapse of a sinister manipulation but also the quiet beginning of a new chapter, one built not on illusion, but on truth, autonomy, and deep, hard-won strength. In the weeks following the explosive cancellation of her wedding, she chose to retreat from the social glare of Port Charles and instead focused on healing. Not just from the trauma of Drew's betrayal, but from years of being pulled in different emotional directions by people who thought they knew what was best for her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't being told how to feel, whom to trust, or what choices to make. The chains Drew had carefully wrapped around her identity, disguised as love, masked as protection, were shattered. And with their destruction came clarity, independence, and a quiet but powerful sense of self-worth. Willow didn't just walk away from Drew that day at Metro Court, she walked away from the idea that she needed someone to define her, to save her, or to make her whole. She began taking control of her life in real, tangible ways. She returned to her medical work, gradually re-entering her professional sphere with the respect and dignity she had always deserved. She established clear, healthy boundaries for herself and her children, Wiley and Amelia, and resumed building a life where they would grow up witnessing their mother not as a victim, but as a woman who stood tall when everything tried to push her down. For Nina, the healing process was slower, but deeply transformative. After months of pain, regret, and estrangement, the moment she saw the understanding in Willow's eyes. The unspoken forgiveness, the shared grief, the maternal bond beginning to mend, something inside her broke free. It was as though a weight she had carried since the day she discovered she had a daughter finally lifted. No longer shackled by secrecy, manipulation, or the fear of rejection, Nina found herself gradually being welcomed back into Willow's life, not just as a biological mother, but as a source of strength. It didn't happen overnight. Trust, once fractured, takes time to rebuild. But each conversation, each small gesture, each truth shared, added bricks back to the foundation they were rebuilding. This wasn't a storybook reunion. It was something more honest, more fragile, and therefore more powerful. And in the heart of this unfolding redemption stood Liesl Albrecht, a woman once feared, once misunderstood, but now proven as a fierce protector, unyielding in her love, formidable in her actions. The very family she once feared she would lose to darkness, scandal, and revenge had found the light again. Not because she saved them with violence or vengeance, but because she used everything she had, her intelligence, her past mistakes, her cunning, her heart, to defend the people she loved. She had stepped into the shadows when others hesitated, spoken truths that others dared not say, and built bridges where only silence and suspicion once stood. Liesl's place in the family had been fully restored. No longer seen solely as the brilliant but controversial doctor, she was now revered as the matriarchal force whose resilience had held everyone together when it all threatened to fall apart. She reconnected with Willow in a way she hadn't dared hope for, watching her grow stronger, more certain, more grounded. She grew closer to Wiley and Amelia, not replacing anyone, but offering wisdom, stories, and the kind of unconditional support that only someone forged in fire can give. Elsewhere, Sasha Gilmore began finding stability for the first time in years. Having endured her own share of tragedy and trauma, she was now building a new life for herself and baby Daisy, far from the chaos of the past, and with the quiet support of those who knew her pain intimately. Jason Morgan had helped guide her there and, in doing so, rediscovered something in himself. The protector, the friend, the man who once stood as the moral compass of Port Charles had been tested by loss, exile, and grief. But now, with Sasha and Liesl's truth-telling mission behind him, Jason found himself able to look in the mirror again without shame. He had made the right call. He had chosen to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. And Sonny Corinthos, once enraged by Nina's secrecy and crushed by what he perceived as betrayal, finally understood.